Okay, so let's get into this. For this deep dive, we're really focusing just on unpacking the core claims and the specific viewpoint in the source material we have.
Right.
Our mission here really is just to lay out what the source itself says, completely impartially. We're not endorsing anything you hear described.
Absolutely. And it's important to state up front, this is a sensitive material the source discusses.
Hmm?
Think of us as just guiding you through this specific document, showing you how it constructs its argument.
Okay,
So,
so the source, it presents a very particular take on recent events, especially in the West, zeroing in on London, the UK.
yeah, and it tries to connect these events to like bigger historical patterns and demographic shifts as it sees them.
It definitely gets into themes of, well, societal change, how governments react to security
Mhm.
incidents.
And what the source feels are major changes in like public conversation and even policy.
So our aim is just to lay out exactly what the source is arguing, how it builds that case, and why it thinks these points matter.
Right. So diving into the source's framing, one of the first big claims is that the West has basically gotten numb.
Numb. How so?
Well, it argues that these events it calls jihadist attacks or Islamic martyrdom missions are happening more often, getting deadlier.
To the point where, in the source's view, they're just seen as normal.
Exactly. Normalized. That's a really strong opening position for the source.
And it uses these symbols, right? The lights on buildings.
Yeah, that's interesting. It points to lighting up landmarks, Sydney Opera House, Empire State Building, Brandenburg Gate, CN Tower, even Tower Bridge in blue, white, and red.
Mm.
Often after event, a source calls Islamic enrichment, and it makes sure to note those colors linked to US, UK, French flags.
So the source sees this as a kind of routine symbolic gesture that actually reinforces the numbness it's talking about.
Precisely. That's how the source presents it, part of the normalization process.
Okay, so then it brings up a specific case study. The Westminster attack,
Yeah.
March 23rd, 2017.
Yeah, uses that to really illustrate its points.
And it described it pretty graphically, doesn't it? The terrorists driving on the bridge, hitting people, police officers included.
Mentions a woman jumping in the river, the attacker then stabbing a police officer near Parliament.
Before being shot.
Right. And the source immediately jumps from that description to its wider points.
It's like the gun control issue.
Exactly. It critiques the laws, suggesting citizens couldn't defend themselves. It makes this very pointed comment about the attacker needing to bin his knife.
Implying that if citizens weren't restricted, things might have been different. That's the source's angle.
That seems to be the implication the source is making, yeah. Linking the specific event to a critique of regulation.
Okay, so building off that incident, the source looks at the official reaction, and it calls it scripted.
Scripted, yes. That's the term it uses.
And it pulls quotes from Theresa May, the prime minister at the time.
It does. It highlights phrases about, violence being doomed to failure against the values of Parliament, things like that.
And the source's interpretation of those statements is,
That they prioritize abstract values like diversity, vibrant enrichment over human lives. That's the source's reading of it, part of the script.
and this is where freedom of speech comes in.
Yeah.
The source finds that mention kind of ironic.
Worse than ironic, it says laughable.
Laughable, okay.
Because the source argues that free speech is actually being shut down, specifically because of rising multiculturalism, in its view. It sees a direct contradiction there.
The source also takes aim quite directly at London's mayor, Sadiq Khan.
It does. It makes this claim that you can't really discuss his alleged ties to Islamic extremism.
Why not, according to the source?
Because people are afraid of being called Islamophobic.
Mm.
The source presents this as a major block on open discussion.
And it brings up a quote from the mayor.
Yeah, the one about terrorist attacks being part and parcel of living in a major city.
How does the source interpret that, given its premise about recent attacks?
Well, since the source assumes recent major attacks in the West are exclusively Islamic, it reads that statement as basically tacit approval and soft jihad support for what it labels hard jihad tactics.
That's a very strong interpretation.
It is, and the source then uses the mayor as a kind of case study for what it expects in the future, a tribalizing of voting patterns in Western democracies.
Moving on, the source also discusses views on Sharia law within the UK.
Right, another element it sees as problematic.
And it makes a specific statistical claim.
Yes, a pretty striking one. It states that almost a quarter of Muslims that live in the UK want the Sharia, meaning Islamic law, implemented across the country.
And the source's position on Sharia is,
That it's fundamentally incompatible, antithetical, is the word used with liberty, democracy, and freedom of speech. So this perceived desire for Sharia is framed as a direct challenge. Okay, so after laying out these specific criticisms, the source then presents this framework. It calls it the comical 6 steps. Yeah, that's the source's term. It's describing what it sees as the standard, predictable Western response pattern after what it terms an Islamic terror attack.
A pattern, a script again. Okay, what's step one, according to the source?
Step 1, tearful and sad cartoons get published.
Right, step two.
Step 2 is Facebook profile picture filters popping up. It specifically mentions the UK flag filter in this context.
Okay, number 3.
3, people crying on TV. Citizens, news anchors, politicians, widespread public emotion displayed.
4 involves those visuals again.
Yes, step 4 is lighting up famous buildings red, white, and blue again and holding candlelight vigils. The symbolic stuff we talked about earlier, now placed in this sequence.
Got it. Step 5. What's the narrative focus then in the source's view?
The source claims step 5 is dominated by the media pushing the idea that Muslims are actually the real victims.
So.
And that Islam itself has been, hijacked by extremists who misunderstand what the source ironically calls a true pacifist Islam.
Okay. And the final step, number 6. Sounds like the source is pretty cynical about this one.
Extremely. Step 6, according to the source, is just virtue signaling tolerance and then basically waiting for the next attack to happen.
And it sums it all up as wash, rinse, repeat. That's the source's phrase. It presents this cycle as proof that the Western response is just ineffective and completely predictable.
Now, to back up this idea that essentially nothing will happen in response, the source points to a really controversial example from the past, the Rochdale grooming gangs.
Right. It brings this up as a kind of precedent for inaction, in its view.
And what exactly does the source claim happened there?
It claims authorities basically allowed the grooming, rape, and then pimping out of thousands of young white girls by gangs of Pakistanis. That's the source's stark description.
And the source attributes a specific shocking motive.
It does. It claims it happened for the sole reason of the young girls being white and their sexual abusers were not.
Wow. And why does the source claim authorities didn't act or didn't highlight the attacker's background? The source asserts it was because the authorities didn't want to draw attention to the attacker's origins, claiming they were, and here it links back to London, like the majority of the British capital, London, not European.
So the source uses its claim that nothing happened about Rochdale
to argue that nothing significant will happen now either in response to the attacks it's focusing on. It's drawing a direct parallel to predict future or current inaction. Okay, now we get to the really big picture stuff where the source ties all these threads together into its main thesis.
Right, expanding the view.
It argues that what it calls the imported ideology of Islam is frequently sharing its culture. And it means this negatively through attacks like those in Nice, Brussels, Berlin, London.
And this creates a dilemma for the West.
Yeah, the dilemma the West finds itself in. And the core of that dilemma, according to the source, is that the West is just incapable of admitting its steep demographic and cultural decline.
So a denial of reality in the source's view.
Pretty much. And then it brings in this dramatic historical narrative.
The oldest adversary.
Yes. It identifies Islam as the West's oldest adversary and claims they never really gave up at the gates of Vienna. That was just a tactical truce.
And now, according to the source.
No, the source claims this adversary is moving in to fill the vacuum left by Western decline and is basically playing the West like a fiddle. That's the phrase it uses.
And it structures this alleged challenge as a 3-pronged attack. Let's break that down. What's the first prong?
First prong, according to the source, hard jihad attacks, the actual violent incidents. The source claims these are unending and actually increasing.
Okay. Second prong.
Second is what it calls demographic jihad. This refers to, in the source's terms, unending migration and the establishment of Islamic cultural enclaves within major Western cities. Ties back to those demographic decline arguments.
Right. And the third prong seems a bit different.
Yeah, maybe more subtle. The source says the third prong is using the West's own values against it. Things like tolerance, acceptance, altruism.
How are they used against it, according to the source?
By, quote, weaponizing them with ever more demands made on the host societies and their public purses. So, using Western openness to extract resources and concessions.
And the source mentions the methods used in the hard jihad prong are varied.
Oh, yeah. It notes jihadists are inventive, listing everything from planes, shoes, water bottles, suicide vests, to guns, knives, and vehicles.
And it wraps this whole model up with an analogy.
A pretty blunt one.
Yeah.
It compares the West to proverbial chickens who keep on inviting the fox into the hen house and wonder, why does this keep on happening?
Mm.
And finally, the source circles back to public opinion and speech. It makes some big claims here.
Like what? That people didn't want this.
Exactly. It states very clearly that the violence and what it terms demographic replacement were never wanted by the public at large. And crucially, that the public was never consulted.
It tries to back this up with historical examples.
It does. It brings up Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, which was hugely controversial. The source claims polls back then showed huge support for Powell's anti-immigration views, like 67 to 82% agreement.
And it connects that to election results.
Well, it notes that supporters claimed this sentiment helped the conservatives win in 1970, using it as evidence that public opinion was strong on this but ultimately ignored.
And it claims this wasn't just a UK thing.
No, it broadens it out, asserting that everywhere in the West, where multiculturalism was, in its word, foisted upon people, the population resisted, but it was forced on them anyway.
So if the public didn't want it, according to the source, how is it maintained?
This is where the speech laws come in again. The source concludes that speech laws must be ever more stringently enforced.
Why? To what end?
To silence any opposition, according to the source, and to keep up the pretense of cultural cohesion in cities like London, which the source controversially claims are no longer even British. So suppressing dissent is seen by the source as necessary to manage these changes the public allegedly never agreed to.
Okay, so just to recap, this deep dive is really focused solely on drawing out and presenting the key arguments, the claims, and the very specific perspective within the source material we were given.
Yeah, we've tried to walk through the source's logic, how it frames things like normalization, its use of the Westminster attack, its critique of official responses, figures like Mayor Khan, its views on Sharia.
Right, and that six-step pattern it lays out, the Rochdale example it uses.
And leading up to its bigger thesis about Western decline, this alleged three-pronged attack, and the claims about public opinion and suppressed speech.
We really encourage you, the listener, to think about the points the source itself raises, particularly that idea of a scripted response, or the long historical view it takes, seeing current events as part of a centuries-old dynamic.
And maybe the final thought to leave you with, drawn directly from the source's perspective, is the question it implicitly poses. Is the West, in the source's view, aware of or willing to face up to what it describes as this deliberate, complex challenge? Or is it, to use the source's own closing words, just being played like a fiddle?